In early 2025, President Trump reignited trade wars, abruptly imposing sweeping 25% tariffs on all imports from Canada and Mexico. The announcement sent shockwaves through the continent, catching businesses and governments off guard and upending years of careful economic integration. Almost overnight, the economic foundation of North America was shaken. Stock markets tumbled, investors panicked, and ordinary citizens in all three countries braced for the fallout. The USMCA, once celebrated as a symbol of North American unity and prosperity, proved powerless against the force of a single presidential decree. The spirit of cooperation that had defined the region for decades was suddenly in jeopardy. Canada and Mexico, typically rivals in the lucrative U.S. market, found themselves forced into an uneasy partnership. Their leaders, recognizing the threat to their economies, quickly formed a fragile alliance, hoping that collective action might pressure Washington to reconsider. High-level talks began in earnest, with diplomats scrambling to craft joint retaliatory tariffs targeting politically sensitive U.S. industries. The stakes were high, and every move was scrutinized by the world. But beneath the surface, deep differences emerged. Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, faced mounting pressure at home to project strength and defend Canadian jobs, industries, and national pride. Meanwhile, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum confronted growing public anger and protests, but she also feared that a full-blown trade war could devastate Mexico's already fragile economy. The alliance, built out of necessity rather than trust, was quickly tested by diverging national interests and political realities. For Canada, the tariffs threatened entire sectors, especially manufacturing, lumber, and automotive industries, putting thousands of jobs at risk and raising fears of a deep recession. For Mexico, the economic shock risked sparking widespread social unrest, with empty markets and rising unemployment fueling anger in the streets. The plan for a united front was ambitious, but cracks were already forming as each country struggled to balance national interests with the need for solidarity. The coming months would reveal just how fragile and how vital this partnership truly was, as North America faced its greatest test in a generation. The alliance fractured, and the sense of unity that once defined North America's trade partnership began to unravel almost overnight. As soon as retaliation plans emerged, the atmosphere shifted from cautious optimism to open hostility, with each country weighing its next move. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, hit back hard, imposing $20.7 billion in tariffs on U.S. goods, targeting swing states and key industries like automotive and agriculture, hoping to maximize political pressure on Washington. Mexico, despite mass protests erupting in the streets and mounting public anger, chose diplomacy over confrontation, suspending its own tariffs and seeking negotiations, determined to avoid further economic pain. This split in strategy handed the Trump administration a classic divide-and-conquer advantage, allowing them to isolate Canada and play the two neighbors against each other. Canada's aggressive stance left it exposed to U.S. countermeasures, while Mexico's caution preserved dialogue but weakened their joint leverage, making it harder to present a united front. Provincial leaders in Canada, like Ontario's Doug Ford, threatened further escalation, calling for even tougher measures to defend Canadian interests. But as the economic fallout became undeniable, businesses suffering, jobs at risk, and markets reacting, these leaders quickly backed down under mounting pressure. The vision of a united front collapsed. Canada stood alone, struggling to sustain its bold policy as international support faded and the costs mounted. The U.S. exploited the rift, negotiating separately with each country and undermining any hope of coordinated resistance or a fair deal for all. The alliance's power was neutralized before it could truly begin, leaving both Canada and Mexico weaker than before. The cost of disunity was becoming painfully clear, as businesses shuttered, workers faced uncertainty, and the dream of a strong North American partnership faded into the background. As Mexico negotiated, the U.S.-Canada trade war escalated. The auto industry was hit hard. Trump imposed 25% tariffs on imported vehicles, disrupting cross-border supply chains and spiking prices. Canada retaliated with its own auto tariffs, but the tit-for-tat only deepened uncertainty for manufacturers and consumers. Trump's unpredictable tariff changes made business planning impossible, chilling investment. Legal challenges briefly paused some tariffs, but the administration pressed on, doubling steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%. The conflict soon spilled into the digital realm, with both sides targeting new sectors. Each escalation pulled Canada deeper into economic turmoil, even as it tried to defend its sovereignty. the North American trade dream was unraveling fast. In June, Canada raised the stakes with a 3% digital services tax on U.S. tech giants, retroactive and worth billions. Ottawa framed it as tax fairness, but Washington saw it as a direct attack on American innovation. Trump responded with fury, threatening massive retaliation and halting all progress from the recent G7 summit. The tax moved the conflict beyond goods, targeting the digital economy and inflaming tensions. Carney's government gambled that the U.S. would negotiate a global digital tax framework, but acting alone and already embroiled in a trade war, Canada's move was risky. The U.S. threatened to hit untouched Canadian industries, escalating the economic pain. The digital tax was popular at home, but it left Canada dangerously exposed. The gamble would soon backfire. The U.S. response was swift. Trump suspended all trade talks with Canada, slamming the door on diplomacy. Canada, isolated and reeling, faced a stark choice: push ahead with the digital tax and risk economic disaster, or retreat and suffer political humiliation. Business leaders warned of catastrophic job losses if the standoff continued. The U.S. wielded its economic power mercilessly, forcing Canada's hand. The alliance with Mexico had collapsed, and Canada's bold moves had only deepened the crisis. Just 2 days after talks were suspended, Carney announced Canada would retract the digital tax. He called it a step toward renewed negotiations, but it was widely seen as a capitulation. The cost of going it alone was now undeniable. Canada's strategy had unraveled completely. The North American trade war sent shockwaves worldwide. The U.S.'s aggressive tariffs signaled a new era of transactional, unpredictable trade policy. The EU hit back with $28 billion in tariffs on U.S. goods. China escalated its own dispute and filed a WTO complaint. Global supply chains strained under the pressure, fueling economic anxiety. Some nations, like the UK, chose accommodation over confrontation, seeking bilateral deals with the US. The world watched as alliances fractured and nationalist interests took center stage. The personal feud between Trump and Carney became a global spectacle, symbolizing the breakdown of old norms. Canada's defiance and retreat resonated with other leaders facing similar dilemmas. The crisis redefined the rules of global trade. The Canada-Mexico alliance, once seen as a promising counterweight to U.S. dominance, crumbled under relentless American pressure. This dramatic unraveling exposed the stark limits of what middle powers can achieve when faced with a superpower's economic leverage and political will. As Mexico pivoted to direct negotiations with Washington, Canada found itself increasingly isolated. The U.S. quickly exploited this division, neutralizing any hope of a united front and driving a wedge between its two neighbors. In response, Canada launched aggressive trade retaliation and introduced a digital tax, hoping to force concessions. Instead, these moves only escalated the conflict, leading to a humiliating retreat as the government faced mounting pressure at home and abroad. The episode revealed a harsh reality. Sovereignty and national pride are difficult to defend when a country is so deeply dependent on a larger neighbor's economy. The cost of defiance proved far greater than anticipated. Canada's economy was battered by tariffs and uncertainty, with businesses suffering and the government's credibility weakened on the world stage. Mexico, while avoiding direct confrontation, still suffered under the weight of U.S. tariffs. Forced to negotiate from a position of weakness, its leaders struggled to protect domestic industries and jobs. Public anger simmered in both countries. Citizens took to the streets and social media, criticizing their leaders for failing to stand up to the U.S. and for the economic pain that followed. As of August 2025, tensions remain high. Tariffs are still in place, trade agreements lie in tatters, and trust between the three nations has been deeply damaged. The failed alliance stands as a cautionary tale. In a world marked by rising nationalism and shifting alliances, cooperation between nations is fragile, and the risks of going it alone are greater than ever. North America has learned a sobering lesson. Standing together is far more complicated than simply sharing an adversary. True unity requires trust, resilience, and a willingness to put aside differences, qualities that proved elusive when it mattered most.